If you would have asked me 5 years ago what the on-trend brewing thing would be in 2021, I never would have guessed that hard seltzer water would be so popular. Laugh all you want, but hard seltzer is a fantastic day drinker and likely isn't going anywhere in the near future. Imperial Yeast's new seasonal strain, W04 Paramount, can help brewers get the most out of their seltzer fermentations. A clean and aggressive fermenter, Paramount will produce an excellent seltzer with low fusel alcohols, and it's produced in a gluten-free medium. If you've tried making seltzer with standard ale or lager strains, you know the struggle, and Imperial Yeast is here to help with W04 Paramount. Check it out at imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. As consumers increasingly seek healthier alternatives like low-carb or low-cal beverages, non-alcoholic beers have grown in popularity. There's been some research profiling the beers themselves and ways to accentuate flavors, but what about the consumers purchasing and consuming the beers? I'm your host, Cade Jordan, and today I'm back in the lab with my co-host, Jordan Folks, as we apply the science from last week's episode. Jordan, welcome back to the Brew Lab.
Thanks, Cade. You know, it's probably obvious that I really like beer, but, you can't just drink this stuff all day, every day. And so I think that non-alcoholic beers are a really kind of nice option in a world where you still want some beer flavor in your mouth, but you don't need the intoxication or the calories to go along with it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've said this a whole bunch of times on the Brewlosophy podcast with Marshall. Anytime we talk about non-alcoholic beers, I'm a fan. I like them. I've got non-alcoholic beers in my fridge right now, and it's just nice sometimes. Like you said, I like alcohol in beer, right? I like beer, and one of the reasons why I like it is because it's got alcohol in it, and I don't want to shy away from that, but sometimes it's nice, right? Like on a Tuesday or Wednesday night after a long day, I want a beer, but I don't necessarily want the alcohol. So I'll just reach for something non-alcoholic. And the options are increasing pretty amazingly, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but not like Corvallis is that far from Portland, but the options here at Corvallis are pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's interesting. They're at the grocery store, but it seems like nowhere else. I don't know that you can really get them reliably at gas stations, and you do not see microbreweries offering it in their tap rooms. Nor do you see it at bars.
Right.
And so I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit later about where these are consumed, but it's kind of a shame that you don't really see it outside of the grocery store beer aisle.
I know. Yeah. We'll see what Dr. Matt McSweeney's research panelists thought about this. And so that was last week's episode. So Dr. McSweeney is, he's the director for the Center for Sensory Research of Food at Acadia University. And he and some of his undergrad students did a look into consumer perception and behavior with respect to non-alcoholic beer. And this week we'll be applying the science, discussing terms like conceptualism, and also sharing our thoughts about who drinks non-alcoholic beers, when, where, and why. Becoming a patron of Brewlosophy is pretty awesome. If you haven't done that already, in addition to the feel-good vibes of supporting all the free content we're providing, you get awesome rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session. And speaking of content, with the addition of the new Brewlosophy show on YouTube, the crew is now pumping out original content every day of the work week. All right, that's Monday through Friday. Every single day, you're getting original content. I'm not aware of any other group that's putting out brewing-related content in the way we are, and we're able to keep doing this because of our awesome patrons. So seriously, if you're not a patron, you should seriously consider becoming one. All the information you need is at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Also, please consider leaving a rating or review of the show. I read every review, and it helps others like you find the podcast. So wherever it is that you're listening to podcasts, if you're able to leave a rating or review, please do so. This week's feedback is brought to you by the imaginative crew at Haas, who developed a revolutionary way to dry hop using Spectrum, a flowable 100% hop-derived product that's fully dispersible in cold side applications for great flavor, efficiency, and less beer loss. No solids means less loss, and it's fully dispersible in cold beer, so there's no contact or residency time required like traditional dry hopping. Spectrum fully disperses immediately, so you don't need to wait 24 to 48 hours or worry about double dry hopping, and you don't have to have any special dry hopping equipment. It stores easily and is easy to use, saving you precious time and getting instant aroma in each batch. It's currently available to commercial brewers in trial quantities of Citra and Mosaic, so check it out by visiting johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, Haas.com. All right, on the last Applying the Science episode, Jordan, we talked about reusing spent hops based on Dean Hauser's work, and you asked what happens to the beta acids. They exist, and so we've spent all this time talking about alpha acids and how they isomerize and what they do in the boil. You asked what happens to them. Do you remember this, Jordan?
Yeah, right. I was curious if they provide some bitterness that may stick around.
Yeah, exactly. And it turns out they do provide some bitterness, but that stick around part is what's difficult. I did some research on this, and it turns out that beta acids don't isomerize during the boil. So they don't survive in high quantities in finished beer. There's this slight structural difference between alpha acids and beta acids, which I should have remembered from my discussion on IBUs with Dr. John Paul May from Hopsteiner in episode 72. That was the one where he discovered a new hop compound, and we went into quite a bit of detail about the structure of the hop compounds. And he mentioned that alpha acids have this hydroxyl group, and anytime you hear the word hydroxyl or OH, all you should think about is soluble in water or beer, right? That's not the only thing, but that's the main thing for us. And so that OH group, with heat and time, alpha acids are able to restructure themselves into iso-alpha acids. So again, it's just like folding the piece of paper. They're not changing. They're like, the compounds that are in the molecules that are in the compound. It's just restructuring it. Beta acids have two prenyl groups. They don't have this hydroxyl. So they're not as reactive, and they don't isomerize during the boil. So beta acids stay largely insoluble and rarely survive into the finished beer. But it's still, interesting to think about. They are bitter. And so the beta acids that do make it into beer, they would increase bitterness. And so John Paul May in that episode told me that alpha acids, just regular alpha acids, are 10 times less bitter than iso-alpha acids. And beta acids are 10 times less bitter than iso-alpha acids. So beta acids are not as bitter as iso-alpha acids, which is, again, they are contributing some bitterness, but not making it all the way through the boil. So that was pretty interesting, and I had totally forgotten about that when I was talking about that with John Paul May, but it was a great question.
Yeah, right. So I guess this is an example of one of those non-alpha acid bittering compounds. There are some things in the hop outside of alpha acid, but I guess that's where we get the bulk of the bitterness from.
Yeah, exactly. We get the bulk of the bitterness from the isos. But that's also, actually, you were the one that put me in touch with John Paul Hosom, and we did that show on the IBU, right, with his IBU calculator, the homebrewer that did something like 700 or 300 beers or something like that, to calculate IBUs. And that was his big deal, is like, hey, we can calculate isos all we want, but if we're dry hopping and doing things, that's adding a whole bunch of these auxiliary bitter compounds that are coming into the beer. So yeah, that was from you. Thanks, Jordan, for that show idea.
That's right, the ABCs.
Yeah, the ABCs. That's exactly right. That'd be a fun Applying the Science. Maybe we'll have to come back, find a way to come back to some of those older shows at some point in the future. But in any event, we're going to tackle non-alcoholic beers, who drinks them and why, and we'll do that after this short break. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app. Who, what, when, where, and why are the questions that Dr. Matt McSweeney asked Nova Scotian beer drinkers about non-alcoholic beers. The results made sense, at least to me, but our task, Jordan, is to break down the science and talk about how to apply it in the brewery. So where should we start?
Well, I got to say, I really liked this one from a personal perspective because this is really similar to the type of research I do. Surveys, focus groups. I'm a social scientist at heart. And so it was really cool to get to listen to an episode where we're really learning more about the human experience, because obviously iso alpha acids, bringing it back to the last segment, this stuff does matter, and we can research it in a scientific laboratory setting and measure it. But do people care? And what do people think? Yeah. And so it was really cool to kind of hear what consumers in Canada think about non-alcoholic beers.
Yeah, I know. That's actually a really awesome thing. I didn't even think about it until you and I were just talking before the show. But yeah, you're doing a lot of this research, which is cool. I'm going to ask you some questions then about like focus groups and like what happens in those, because some of these things are things that we don't see a lot in the brewery because it's kind of expensive to get 20 or 30 people in a room, and just ask them questions, pay them for that and take away information from those. But yeah, so this was the cool part. You mentioned that it's kind of like looking at the consumer here. We had episode, I think it was episode 72, maybe 52. I forgot to write it down, but it was the one with Dr. Scott LaFontaine, where he looked at the beer itself, right? Like you said, he was measuring all these different compounds like hexanols and all of the, aldehydes, and correlating those to taste, right? To flavors that consumers were picking up. And he also asked them a whole bunch of liking questions to figure out what flavors they liked or didn't. But this is not, it's not flipping it totally on its head, but it is like looking at the consumers, right?
Right. So maybe we can dive into this study that's on the non-alcoholic side of the consumer equation.
Yeah, exactly. On the non-alcoholic side. Well, and Scott's was on non-alcoholic beers. So he was looking at non-alcoholic beers, but looking more at the beer itself and like what different methods and stuff you can use to do the beer. But this was cool. And, I keep saying it. I keep bringing up the 5 W's, right? Because that's the way I sort of interpreted his study. It's who and where, who drinks non-alcoholic beers and where do they drink them? What do they drink? Why? What do they like? Are they drinking, porters? Are they drinking pale ales? Are they drinking, light lagers? What are they drinking? And then why? And so they asked them all these emotional response questions about, when you look at this beer, how do you feel? Do you feel bored? Or do you feel, pleasant? Or do you feel excited, or any of those things? And I had sort of, and so this is Cade's big takeaway. Okay. I tried to summarize in one sentence all of the results from this study, which was kind of impossible, and it's a really long sentence, but here I go. Okay. So people who want to avoid alcohol, not for medical or health reasons, drink fruity, non-alcoholic beers at home because it makes them feel pleasant. That feels a lot like I just read like a clue, a clue is like Professor Plum in the library with the rope kind of thing, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's almost got like a bit of a haiku or some sort of it's like a little poem.
Yeah.
I love it.
Right? Like a little poem. Who wants it, where, when, and why? And yeah, so, I'll read the sentence again just so that we've got it, but then we'll move on. But yeah, again, people who want to avoid alcohol drink fruity, non-alcoholic beers at home because it makes them feel pleasant. That's kind of that's an oversimplification, a vast oversimplification of that research. And we're going to dig into the details a little bit more here. But we should start with this idea of conceptualism. Do you remember what we was talking about here with conceptualism?
It's something like contextualism. I'm a little confused. I'd love for you to recap it for us.
Yeah, I think contextualism is a good way to describe it too, right? It's understanding the contexts, like understanding what not just context, but concepts as well. Like conceptually, what are people thinking about whenever they're drinking a beer? What are they feeling? Where are they? What are they? Who is the person that's there? So it's like thinking about these people in all of their different contexts. It's understanding where the consumers are and why. Maybe it is better described as contextualism, or at least maybe my understanding of it is better described as contextualism. But it's putting the beer in its location location, in its setting, right? We're not in a lab tasting it, asking a consumer, well, we are in this case, asking a consumer to taste the beer, but we're trying to figure out where would they be, like if consumers were out there in the wild consuming non-alcoholic beers, where would they be? Does that make sense?
Yeah, right. Okay, so I think that your culinary experience, your experience with the beverage really is influenced by your set and setting, right? Mm-hmm. So a really nice restaurant with the tablecloths and candles, and it really elevates the experience and the way that you perceive that meal, even if it was the same temperature, the same ingredients, the same chef, cooked in your backyard, could be a totally different, sensory experience for the meal. And I think that we see that with beer too.
Yeah.
And this is a beverage that's really associated with kind of being out. And in this modern world with canned beer, you don't have to be out anymore. And so I could totally see how the context of your experience would kind of dictate the type of beverage you go for.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I always used to say every beer has its place, right? Or location. It has its time to shine. I've said a whole bunch of times, I'm a big fan of light lagers. I mean, I think, I don't know about you, Jordan, but a lot of the crew are really big into the macro light lagers. I mean, we drink them a lot, have them in our refrigerators.
I just prefer Hellas.
Yeah. You would score highly on the food-related lifestyle quiz, maybe.
Oh yeah, I definitely self-identify there.
Yeah. But again, it's like, it's figuring out where are consumers going to this. I mean, I'll drink light lagers at home. I don't normally order light lagers at restaurants. If I'm going out to a restaurant, I'm going to order something like a pale ale or an IPA or a porter, whatever goes with my meal. And it kind of made me think about this in a different way. Like, where am I drinking non-alcoholic beers? And your point at the top of the show, I'm not drinking them at breweries or at bars or at restaurants, even for that matter. I'm not going out to those places. I'm just drinking them at home.
Well, and that's not necessarily the case in Germany. Non-alcoholic beer is everywhere over there, and you can definitely get it at a restaurant. But here in America, it just hasn't caught on in the same way. And it's kind of a shame, because I've honestly not tried that many, because they're just not readily accessible when you're out and about. And I don't buy a ton of beer at the grocery store, but when I do, I'm definitely not looking for non-alcoholic options.
Right, exactly. I'll do it for Dry January. I try to do Dry January every year, so I'll stock up on those. But I also like to have them just during the work week. But yeah, I was thinking about this, and we're going to get into the focus group results here in just a second, and I think this will sort of segue into it. But I was thinking about this. I was like, well, what about the people who are designated drivers, right? I mean, that's becoming an increasingly popular thing. You go out with a group of people, and one of them is the designated driver. And that's, everybody getting home safely. And that's a huge and important part of drinking responsibly, socially drinking responsibly. So like, what about those people? They just have to drink water and like suck it up. That's it. They can't have non-alcoholic beer. I mean, it seems like there would be some sort of market, for people like that are out at bars and restaurants, or people who are just out at a bar and restaurant with a friend and they just don't want to drink alcohol.
Right. Or they just wanted one. I know that me personally, if you're not drinking, you're the designated driver, you need something in your hand where it's just awkward.
Yeah.
Right. And pounding water just doesn't have the same effect. And I know that we're getting tons of calories through drinking beer, but like, I'm not going to chug 10 sodas. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that carbonated water is a really good option actually there, but it would be great if there was high quality non-alcoholic beers to choose from.
Oh, yeah.
Which isn't always the case.
Exactly, right? And I think about this too. Here's another situation that I relate to a lot as well. So beer conferences. Okay, I mean, obviously Nova Scotian beer drinkers aren't going to be attending beer conferences regularly. But if you've been to a beer conference, if you've been to, the National Homebrew Conference, commercial conferences are no different, like CBC, MBAA meetings, ASBC meetings, EBC meetings. There's a crap load of beer. Right. I think it was actually kind of funny. One person described it to me one time. She used to tell her employees, she would say, "There is more beer than you can drink here. Please don't try." And I think about that. And I've noticed like some of those nights, like you get there and you've been drinking since, I don't know, 10 in the morning, noon. I mean, when you woke up and had breakfast, I mean, you're drinking beer all day. You get into the afternoon and it's like, goo, like I got to have some water or something that's not alcohol, or I'm going to pass out in about 2 hours. And so I've actually started doing this. I started switching to the non-alcoholics in like the middle of the afternoon and the early evening, so that I can rehydrate myself. And it's nice though to like, hey, I'm still drinking a beer with you, Jordan. We're still at the conference. You're drinking, I'm drinking. We're having a good time, but I'm drinking something non-alcoholic. I'm doing that for my own personal health. I have terrible hangover genes, and that's something that I've been doing.
Yeah, and I swear that I don't drink for the intoxication. I drink for the flavor. And so I don't want to drink so much that I'm passing out, right?
Yeah.
That's not what I'm going for. But that being said, that is an inevitable consequence if you keep drinking this tasty beverage.
Yeah.
And so I'm all for high quality non-alc beers. But I've just really yet to have any that really blew me away. I've had some that are like, wow, that's pretty close, but nothing that's like, I need this in my fridge. What about you?
Yeah, no, I think I'm probably in the same boat. And I think it's sort of unfair. And we're way off digressing in this, but this is okay. I'm having a good conversation here. I think it's sort of unfair to compare non-alcoholic beers to beer, right? Because you're missing ethanol, you're missing the alcohol, and that's just an important part. It's like, okay, make make chicken fettuccine Alfredo, but don't use chicken, right? Or something, or don't use Alfredo sauce, use marinara or something, and it's just kind of hard, right? Like there are ways that you can make it taste similar, but it just doesn't necessarily taste the same. That said, everything that Athletic is doing, I'm loving those beers. Those beers are really good. I keep those in my fridge. Also, there's a brand called Well-Being that I've had that's got currently my favorite, which they have a beer called Victory Wheat. And that one's got a little bit of lemon in it. It's a wheat beer. It tastes just like a summer, light American wheat beer. It's got all the body and everything, but it is missing the alcohol. And sometimes that's, Marshall says it all the time. There's a reason why he drinks beer. And it's because, if he didn't want alcohol, he just wouldn't drink like non-alcoholic beer. He'd just drink something else, like sparkling water or soda or, something else. He wouldn't just grab a non-alcoholic beer. He would just not drink beer that night, or probably just not drink at all. There's not like, he doesn't need that option or that beer flavor, to get him, to enjoy. He'll just go with a totally different beverage.
Yeah, well, my problem is I do want to drink beer all the time, but I know I can't.
Yeah, exactly.
So I really like this idea of a good non-alcoholic beer. I haven't been able to try Athletic yet. I know they're around, and so I definitely need to give them a try. But in terms of the non-alc beers I've had, some have come pretty close, and so I know it can be done. But it's difficult either. You recently did an experiment, right? And you can start low and finish low, and then could be kind of thin. Or you could start medium level, but then not go very, very far down. So then it's really sweet. And it's like, no matter what we do, it's just, we're skipping certain steps that we would do in a normal brew. And it's just challenging for that all to add up to a product that we would kind of judge equally.
Yeah. And maybe that's one of those reasons why, right? Like maybe that's a reason why people aren't going out, at breweries or wherever, and consuming non-alcoholic beers, because it just doesn't have that equality, right? It's kind of like, this is I don't want to say that they're knockoff beverages. That's not what I'm trying to say, but it's just like, it's maybe it's just got that sort of consumer perception. And I guess that kind of makes sense. Let's segue into the focus group results a little bit, because that is one of the big things that they mentioned as part of the focus groups is like the number, I'll read the top 5 from the focus groups of people who are drinking non-alcoholic beers: pregnant women, older adults, dieters, and alcohol avoiders, and people who are avoiding due to medicine or religious beliefs. So that's like the list of people that the focus group identified as not drinking alcohol. I guess I fall into the alcohol avoider, but that's not like a full-time thing for me. This is like, I'm not, I'm not a teetotaler. I drink alcohol. I mean, so this was interesting. And this was one of the things that Matt brought up. He was kind of disappointed in the results of his focus group because he was like, he didn't see himself represented in what they were saying because he's sort of like, I guess, like you and me, like occasionally we just want beer flavor, but not the alcohol. It's not avoiding alcohol like totally as part of a lifestyle. It's just right now, I don't want to drink. I don't want to get drunk right now, or I don't want to drink alcohol.
Well, and I think that the limited number of categories there is a function of the method. Remember, these were standard, lay people that were recruited to do these focus groups. They were not self-identified NA enthusiasts.
Sure.
So they're kind of like forecasting who they think might be the type of person to drink non-alcoholic beer. And as we're seeing with the author, like ourselves, there's clearly more than these 5 or 6 categories. It's just that this is what the standard consumer thinks the NA consumer looks like.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting point. This is what the standard consumer thinks the NA consumer looks like. So I had some questions about this focus group thing. So I've not ever been a part of a focus group, and I've never run one. But you've run several. So like, how do focus groups work? And like in this context, like what are you asking, or what are you trying to get from the group?
Sure. So a focus group is typically a smaller sample than a survey. These are ends of 10 and 12, so 2 focus groups with 10 or 12 people in the room. You typically have a facilitator, maybe a couple even, and basically you're asking questions or providing some sort of visual or auditory or even sensory stimuli, like a TV commercial or a poster or a beer or beer ads, perhaps. And or you just ask them questions and you facilitate a discussion. And so unlike a survey, which has larger samples and thus ultimately statistically significant results should a difference be found in the analysis, a focus group is a qualitative method where we're not trying to run any sort of statistical analyses on it. We're just trying to kind of thematically describe what we heard from the discussions in the focus group. So in this case, asking a customer or a consumer in the focus group, who do you think drinks non-alc beer could, stimulate some discussion, thus creating richer discussions from respondents, because people just feel kind of weird providing a ton of data in a survey experience. So if you want to get really rich data and really understand the who, what, when, where, and why, a qualitative focus group is a better method because you're going to elicit just way more rich discussion and depth of response than you would from a survey that you take on your smartphone.
So it's like a focus group. Is that sort of like the first round? Like if you don't, like if I was going into this and I don't know anything about like who, what, when, where, or, drinks non-alcoholic beers, that's a good way to just sort of see what people think, right? And then use that to guide maybe your further research.
That's a great strategy, and that's really a best practice that ideally you will do a focus group before you do a big quantitative survey, especially for things that are not well known or well tested. If you've been doing a longitudinal survey for the last 40 years, you don't necessarily need a focus group prior to that survey.
Sure.
But if we want to learn more about some brand new app that doesn't even exist yet, maybe starting with a focus group and then it goes into field or whatever. It's like a live app that people can download. Then you could start doing surveys based on the early feedback you got in the focus group stage. So definitely a best practice, but this stuff ain't free. So you don't necessarily see most studies going that extra mile because it's really expensive to do both qual and quant.
Yeah, right. Because I mean, look at just like the number of participants, right? I mean, in this one, like we said, we had a group of 10 and a group of 12. That's 22 participants, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're paying these people for their hour and you're trying to organize them and get them there and you're spending time talking with them and you're providing samples or sensory stimulus, I mean, that's expensive and that adds up. I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand about sensory research is things add up. The costs really can balloon. But then, the Cade and hedonic responses, I think he had like 100 participants in the Cade or something close to that.
Right. And so once you get into sample sizes that large, you can actually have a little bit more confidence and precision in your results. And your point estimates can actually more reasonably represent the population from which they came. But when you only talk to 10 people in a room, it's a really, like you said, a good opportunity to get that first kind of crack at what the consumer opinion might be. But you can't really be confident that that represents the opinions of all consumers or even a larger, cross section. And so I think that when you get into things like Cade and hedonic liking, you can have a larger sample size and be a little bit more confident in the results that you observe.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what Matt mentioned, right? I mean, he did mention that like those results, that's one of the limitations of a focus group is you're limited to what the participants discuss, right? You can't, and like he said, he didn't see himself included in the profile of the non-alcoholic beer drinker from the focus group. So Matt is a consumer. I'm a consumer. I've consumed, and purchased non-alcoholic beers. And again, I see myself a little bit in alcohol avoiders, but I'm not trying to, I'm a beer drinker, and I would consider myself a beer drinker that also drinks non-alcoholic beers occasionally. And I didn't really see that listed on here. But one of the other cool things that I thought here, and you mentioned this and we've talked about it already, but it bears repeating again. When you ask people where they drink non-alcoholic beers, their answers are at home or anywhere. And by anywhere, they just meant like you can consume non-alcoholic beers anywhere and not worry about driving, right? So that wasn't necessarily meant like, yeah, you can go and take your non-alcoholic beers wherever. It just meant like it was more about they don't have alcohol in it, and so you can consume them anywhere. You can consume them on the beach or in the park or wherever, or at a restaurant and not worry about driving. And then they said family events where kids are present, and I was like, that's really interesting. I'm okay with my kids being around alcohol. We're going to talk to them. They're still young enough that they don't even understand what beer is. But it's really interesting because bars and breweries are not listed here, and restaurants, right? Bars, breweries, and restaurants not listed. And I wonder, like you mentioned, if you ask this of Germans or of Australians, New Zealanders, Great Britain, or anybody in the, not just Great Britain, the UK, anybody in Europe, they might have wildly different expectations here. They might be going, you stupid Americans, why aren't you drinking non-alcoholic beers in restaurants, bars, and breweries?
Right. And that's a good point, is that not only is this study, the focus group component, limited by the small sample size, which again is just how that method goes, but it's limited to Nova Scotian attitudes as well. And really the convenient sample of those, around the university that they got. And so when listening to this episode, I thought it was really great, and this happens all the time. You don't expect someone to have a worldwide representative sample in a focus group,
of course,
but it couldn't help make me wonder what the results had been like if they had done this with a bunch of like San Diego scene beer nerds or Florida diehard non-alc beer drinkers, right? Like the type of people that you recruit into your study is going to really influence the type of results that you see. And so I think that is an important caveat here, is that it's limited to the Nova Scotia sample that they had. Yeah,
of course. And Matt was very clear about that. And that's going to come through too, even with the Cade and the emotional response data, right? This is limited to Nova Scotian beer drinkers and their preference. And also Scott, whenever I talked to Scott LaFontaine about the non-alcoholic beers, their sensory was done at Cal Davis. So again, theirs were California IPA drinkers who were mostly in there. And so it made a lot of sense that they liked fruity and tropical flavors. And that was the most prominent thing that consumer looked at. But yeah, if you go into like, deep South, light lager drinkers like my dad, he's not going to drink anything fruity or tropical ever, right? I mean, if he drinks a non-alcoholic beer, he's probably not going to. But if he does drink a non-alcoholic beer, it's going to be something like Bud Zero or, one of those beers that's just our Coors, what is it? Coors Edge or something. I think something like that. I don't remember.
I just had a great idea. What about a non-alcoholic hard seltzer?
Yeah, you just mean sparkling water. I love it.
No. But we're gonna brand it Bud Light, non-alc hard seltzer. It's gonna be a huge hit.
Right, exactly. I got it. We've already got it. I can get the flavors. You bring the carbonated water, and we can do this. All right. So the focus group part again. That's the launching point, and that's how Matt used it. Right, is like launch from here and figure out where we go. And so the next two things that they did is really, I think, where a lot of the meat of the study comes in, and where they can start to make, like you said, more bigger interpretations about the data set and who, what, when, where, and why. And it's when we start looking at the kata and the hedonic liking. And I wanted to spend a couple of seconds. I've done a lot with kata, with check all that apply. So that stuff sort of comes naturally to me. And I wanted to make sure that you like that it's understandable. I mean, Jordan, did you understand like what kata is and what it all, what people are asked to do and why it's important and what the information that comes out of that study is?
Yeah, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but from what I recall, it's basically a survey method, right? And you're just like multiple response selecting what you're getting.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. I mean, there will be somewhere between, 15, 20, 25 choices, and you taste the beer, and if you taste fruity, you check it off. If you taste, tropical, you check it off. The difficult part of kata is that you're limited to just what the surveyors come up with, right? So like if you taste, let's say, dank, and dank isn't a word, right? But there may be like sweaty or resinous or some of these other hoppy descriptors. You might just have to click one of those other check boxes, even though you're thinking in your mind dank. So that's sort of a limitation of check all that apply. But again, it's a really nice tool because it's really easy to use, and a lot of consumers can get it really quickly.
Yeah, and a method like that is both a blessing and a curse in the sense of it's really difficult to elicit open-ended, unassisted responses from survey respondents, right? And so the trade-off there is you're also going to get false negatives when you give them a list, because if you just have them type it in, people are going to be lazy or going to feel unconfident, and so they're going to not provide as many selections if they had to type them in unassisted, no stimuli to choose from. On the flip side, if you give them a big list, like, yeah, that's fruity, right. And so you're going to get some things that wouldn't necessarily exist otherwise.
Yeah. But
the trade-off is really small, lacking data. And so I think this is a good it's like kind of the lesser of two evils, I think.
Yeah. And again, this is one that we use all the time at Oregon State. It's a really popular method, especially for breweries and sensory teams, for understanding frequency response data. So like how often something comes up. If there's 20 participants and 19 of them rate the beer as fruity, you've got a pretty good, understanding that beer's fruity,
Exactly. That's where the larger sample sizes come in statistical analysis. We can actually run the numbers, when you have those types of rates, there's probably something real there.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. When you have those high rates, and it's the same thing like we do with the T-test, right? With our triangle test. When you're comparing those beers, when you've got enough participants in the study, you can say with a degree of confidence that you are seeing an effect. And then the cool thing about his study is he paired this check all that apply with hedonic liking, and that I think most people have dealt with. Rate your experience on a scale of dislike extremely to like extremely, right? And then it's just checking one of those. And then he had them rate appearance, flavor, mouthfeel, and overall. But the cool thing that he did in this, and I hadn't seen this before either, was he combined check all that apply and hedonic liking into this penalty lift analysis. And essentially the way he explained that to me is it's like a penalty or a lift, right? Like if you have this attribute, for example, sweet, right? If consumers checked sweet on the beer, it associated with higher liking, right? So you can sort of say that. So in essence, I think if I understood correctly, what that means is like a beer that is sweet or aromatic, consumers, these Nova Scotian beer drinkers, liked more. Whereas beers that were watery, thin, bland, and bitter, if you were checking off those flavors, it was much more likely that beer was going to have a lower liking score, which I thought was really interesting and a cool way to describe the data in a way that I hadn't seen before.
Yeah, it sounds like that's some sort of bivariate analysis where he's looking to see how one variable interacts with the other. So as we're seeing in this case, on beers that people describe something as sweet, they were more likely to have a higher liking rating.
Yeah, exactly. And that was interesting too, right? Sweet and aromatic were the attributes, and so maybe this is a difference between Nova Scotian beer drinkers and, like, for example, Scott LaFontaine's California beer drinkers. They wanted fruity and tropical. Those were the ones that were highest in Scott's study. So maybe this would be different with different tasters.
And bitter flavors were associated with lower liking. And if these Nova Scotians are most likely to consume kind of mass market Canadian lagers like Labatt Blue or something like that, those are not particularly bitter beers.
Yeah, that's true. And there's also this piece of, like, the craft beer drinker, right? I guess this sort of gets into that emotional response piece of it, or the food related lifestyle questionnaire is, I like this. And I feel like this sort of came out of the focus group, is that, the people who are going to consume non-alcoholic beers are people that like beer, right? And so they're going to be people that want and seek out beer, and maybe more often, people who are like craft beer, or like to designate themselves as craft beer drinkers and not macro drinkers. And that was a pretty interesting piece of this too.
Yeah. I mean, I really think that the type of drinker is going to really influence this kind of stuff, and that could even get into a multivariate analysis. We could see that these relationships don't hold up once we start to introduce the type of person that you are. And so I really love that he brought in this emotional response piece as yet another layer to help explain the variation that he's observing.
Yeah, exactly. And while we're on the food related lifestyle questionnaire, I mean, it was people who had higher scores on food related lifestyle, which means that the food is an important part of their lifestyle, right? They prioritize food and those kinds of consumption behaviors. And so people that had high scores on that food related lifestyle questionnaire surprisingly didn't like macro beers.
You know what I wonder is how economics play into this, right? Because is it that people don't like good food, or is it they don't like spending money on good food? And so in a world where high-end food was free or the same cost as lower quality food, would these types of trends still exist? Macro beer is cheaper than craft beer. And so I think that people are, creatures of habit. And I wonder how economics manipulates these trends we're seeing.
Yeah, that's interesting. And because that's another piece of this too. He found there were so many things that he found in the study, but consumers were willing to pay more for non-alcoholic beers, which I thought was interesting. Right? It's like,
see, wait, I'm not.
yeah, right. I wish I had asked him a little bit more questions about that, because I think about it now and I'm thinking like, wait, why? It doesn't have the alcohol in it, but it takes more processing or something, or I don't know. People think it's a little bit more of a specialty product. I mean, I don't know.
Well, it's kind of like light lagers, right? These things aren't cheap and easy to make well. The amount of industrial cost associated with making Budweiser, and yet it's the cheapest thing on the shelf. And so consumers have an expectation that yellow fizzy lager is cheap. And so craft breweries have to charge, or they either have to charge a lower price or struggle to charge the same price as an IPA because the customer just doesn't expect those things to cost the same. And so it's really interesting how a consumer expectation is not necessarily in line with the true cost to provide the product or the service.
Right. Well, and Matt did ask some purchase intent questions, right? To see like, okay, would these, how does this beer look? He showed pictures of the beers to the participants, pictures of the beer and their package, and asked them to rate both their emotional responses to the beer and the package, but also how likely they would be to purchase that beer, which I think is a little bit getting into the economics. Not again, and not as new as what you're saying, which I think would be an awesome study to look at as well. But this was just kind of like, okay, if you look at this beer in this package, how likely are you to purchase it, and what emotions do you feel about this? And he said beers that generated pleasant and interested emotions increased purchase intent, and beers that consumers felt bored about, quote, decreased it. And so I'm wondering if that's like where this like you said, this economic piece of it comes in, right? People who have the economic means to pay more for some of these beers are looking for things that are making them interested or pleasant or not bored, and they're able and willing to pay for those.
Right. I don't think that Miller Lite drinkers are necessarily drinking those for flavor excitement. It might be relatively enjoyable experience for some, but it's not the same thing as like tasting, a vertical of barrel-aged barley wines or something like that. It's just
right.
a fundamentally different experience. And it's not that either one is more valid than the other. It's just that there is this kind of cheapness associated with some products. And I think that one's experience expectations are relative to the cost.
Yeah, I think so too. I think cost definitely plays a role. But the things that Matt looked at, I mean, were really awesome. I mean, starting with the focus group to sort of figure out who and where are drinking non-alcoholic beers, then getting into the kata and the hedonic liking to understand what they're drinking, and then the emotional responses, like why, food-related lifestyle, does that play into it? Does emotions when you see the packaging play into it? It's pretty cool. So that's kind of the overview of the results of the study. So let's take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about implications and maybe applying some of this in your brewing. So hold on just a minute.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
I have several versions of non-alcoholic beers in my refrigerator right now, and I'm in the Pacific Northwest, which is hop country of the USA, so there are definitely several non-alcoholic IPAs, but I also have 2 macro lagers and a couple of athletic offerings, and also that well-being Victory wheat beer that I mentioned earlier. Any non-alcoholic beers in your fridge, Jordan?
Closest thing I've got is soda water, seltzer water.
Yeah, right. That's another question too. What about hop water? Right, that's going to be that's a thing here in the Pacific Northwest now.
The Lagunitas hop water, I don't remember what exactly it's called. The one in the glass bottle. Holy cow, it is really good. I could seriously drink that all day.
Oh man, I'm surprised that you say I can't stand it. I just can't drink
the Lagunitas one.
Yeah, the Lagunitas one. I'm like, oh man, I try to taste this and I'm like, oh, this is terrible. But I've had some that we've brewed here at Oregon State. We did Jeff Clausen, the brewer here, did one with Simcoe, Amarillo, and Citra, and it was fantastic. I thought it was great. But that Lagunitas one, I don't know what it was. Maybe I just got like an old bottle or something. Who knows?
You should try it again. I don't think I've ever heard of a beer fan that didn't like it. It's really impressive, but it's been the only one that really scratched that itch. The other ones I've had, it's just like kind of weird carbonated hop burn water.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. I think that's honestly what I got from the first time that I had the Lagunitas. So it was like carbonated hop burn. And I was like, oh, yeah. But I need to try it again. But it's interesting. Okay, so the reason I asked this question of you, if you've got any non-alcoholic beers in your fridge, is because one of the biggest takeaways from Matt's study is that people like alcoholic beers more than non-alcoholic beers. Or I should say, Nova Scotian beer drinkers in this study liked alcoholic beers more than non-alcoholic beers. And I heard that response and I was like, yeah, awesome.
Well, the market data demonstrates that, right? NA beer is a very small proportion of the market. And like we kind of hinted at earlier, it's just a difficult product to make taste like alcoholic beer. The methods are different, or the interventions to get rid of the alcohol are inevitably going to change the flavor. And so it's been exciting to see people really explore this. And Cade, I'm kind of curious, have you noticed any styles lend themselves to tasting more enjoyable in an NA format?
Man, you see, I wonder if this is maybe influenced by the types of beers that I like to drink, because I like drinking like the Coors Edge or the Bud Zero or the what's another one, Heineken 0.0. I like drinking those, but I also like drinking those macro lagers a lot too. I will say that Victory Wheat is my favorite one right now of the non-alcoholic beers. And that one's got a little bit of lemon in it, but it's still just a light and crushable beer. And maybe that's also sort of what I'm looking for, is something light and crushable. I think that defines my beer drinking. I like IPAs. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm in the Pacific Northwest, and I love some of the offerings that are here. I mean, Crux's non-alcoholic IPA is great. They've even done a hazy one. 10 Barrel's got one out there called NA IPA, right? And I mean, so I've had quite a few of those. Athletic has their IPA as well. I like those. They're great. And I get that people like the fruity drinks in them. But for me, I just kind of like the macro light lager.
Yeah, I had a Heineken 0.0 a few months ago. We went to a restaurant that ended up being they had like a sober bar. I think it was like religious reasons, like looking at the list based on the restaurant. And they had an entire non-alcoholic bar, and they had NA beer, NA cocktails. Did you know that there's like NA spirits now? I'm guessing they're distilling essences of, whatever's in gin or whatever. And it was really cool to see a whole NA bar. And so we tried an NA cocktail, we had an NA beer, and I gotta say the Heineken 0.0, it came pretty darn close. It was pretty cool, but there was this weird like thing as you swallowed or as you exhaled. Have you had one of those recently?
No, it's been a couple months. It's been since like August that I had one. Yeah.
But do you get that on these like light NA lagers type things? This kind of weird thing that I can't really put my finger on.
Yeah, and so this is one where I was talking with Michael Fescher about this, and we were talking about non-alcoholic beers, and some of his colleagues have done research into this, and somebody described it to me as potato starch, and from that moment on, I've started tasting it in almost all of the beers, and it hasn't made me like dislike the non-alcoholic beers. It's just made me not like them as much. And I get this like straight, it's like the licking a raw potato is what it sort of tastes like.
And I think I can see why it's tempting to try to make a more flavorful style as the background for the NA beer. I mean, if you throw enough hops at it, you would think that you could overpower any sort of potato impact. I had a NA sour beer, like a fruited Berliner or something. It was pretty nice. And so I think that this might be one area to kind of play around with more bold flavors. I think they mentioned in the study that no one liked the stout. Have you ever had an NA stout?
I have never had an NA stout, but Athletics Porter I think is fantastic. That's one of my favorite non-alcoholic beers too. I think that was one of the ones, I think I got lucky because I tried that one first out of like whenever I was just trying non-alcoholic beers, because I was like, wait, what? There's a porter? What's that doing up here? All right, I'm going to try that. It's not Bud Zero, which I'd been drinking, or really, honestly, O'Doul's, right? Mm-hmm. It's not O'Doul's, and that's all I had been drinking anytime I would drink a non-alcoholic beer, and I don't like O'Doul's for whatever crazy reason. I don't know why I like Coors Edge and Bud Zero and Heineken Zero and don't like O'Doul's, but for whatever reason I don't. But yeah, that Athletic Porter is fantastic. I wonder if the roast is just too bitter, right? If in a stout, because a stout, it's got that body and that residual mouthfeel that really helps that roastiness play through. Or maybe if people just want that bitter, they'll just drink coffee. Right. Yeah. But I think on the flip side that the extra body that could be present in a NA or low alc beer, because maybe we should even define what NA even means. But I could see how the body that you could get in a stout format could actually kind of work, because you wouldn't want a overly sweet, under attenuated lager. So it seems that going for high FG versus a low FG approach would kind of vary depending on the style that you were hoping to emulate. Sure, yeah, and there's a lot more room in that beer, and maybe that's one of the reasons why I like that porter so much is you can cover, or maybe you can make it pretty sweet, right? And I like that in a porter. I'm not expecting much bitterness or anything. I'm expecting a lot of chocolate, and maybe that covers up, that starchy flavor that I'm tasting. And so maybe same thing in a stout, like, right? You're right, with a high finishing gravity, maybe it could cover up some more things. But I would have thought you could also do that with an IPA, right? Like that you can cover it up with a whole lot of hop flavors or something fruity or tropical, or throwing fruit at it, for example. But then at some point we're getting into, are these really non-alcoholic beers anymore?
What is non-alcoholic beer? Let's define that.
Yeah, so that's a good one. In the United States, and this changes based on where you are regionally in the world. But in the United States, technically non-alcoholic beer, you can label a beer as having no alcohol in it. Well, as being a non-alcoholic beer, if it has less than 0.5% ABV. Now, Heineken 0.0 is actually 0.0% alcohol. And that's because my understanding is in the European Union, you do have to label a beer as low alcohol if it's between, I think, 3.3 and all the way down to 0.1. I can't remember. I'd have to look it up again. But then you can't label it as non-alcohol until it's actually 0.0, or at least in certain areas of the European Union. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting one. And this one came up for me. It was interesting because I saw pregnant women on there. And my wife, while she was pregnant, with both of our kids, she drank a couple of the non-alcoholic beers and then stopped because we read this study that was looking at all these non-alcoholic beers, and most of them have 0.5%. Or right around there, right? Some of them up to even like 0.8 or 0.9. And so she's drinking them thinking, this is marketed to me, a pregnant woman, and there's no alcohol in it, but there is actually alcohol in it. And sometimes not even necessarily exactly what's on the label, which is kind of scary.
But I think I heard something like there's about 0.5 in a banana. So,
Maybe, yeah.
The kombucha has 0.3, 0.5.
Yeah.
And so I think that there are small amounts of, fermented ethanol in our natural world that we are consuming. And I think it's more of a volume game, right? Like you would have to drink a freaking gallon of this stuff to hit a pint of beer. And so it's just not, you're going to overdose from liquid consumption before you'd hit, have any sort of intoxication.
Well, sure, yeah, before you'd hit any kind of intoxication, but it's all the question of processing, and the body keeps processing of alcohol, and if any of that makes its way into the fetus, because even if it is just a little bit getting in there, it can cause a lot of damage, especially when the baby's really small. But any of those reasons, right? I mean, it's interesting, and that was one of the funny takeaways I thought from Matt's experiment, and I mentioned it at the very end of the show, but it was that people didn't seem to care though if it was 0.0 or 0.5% non-alcohol. They were just like, it didn't matter. It didn't affect their purchasing decisions, which I thought was kind of interesting. It did affect my wife, but it doesn't affect a lot of people, right? It didn't affect, the Nova Scotians, and it wouldn't affect me either. Again, because I'm drinking it because it's a beer that doesn't have alcohol. So if it has 0.5% or less, that's not going to bother me.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I just want it to taste good. But if you were truly trying to abstain from any alcohol whatsoever, like a pregnancy, totally makes sense that you would want to be aware of that. And so I think that that's really important from a labeling perspective. It should say the percentage.
Yeah, and there's a lot of lest we forget, there's a huge segment of people who have religious beliefs that they can't consume alcohol, right? None, 0% alcohol, or at least not any that they're aware of. So again, if a beer has even 0.5%, that's not they're not able to consume that for their religious purposes. But okay, so another big takeaway that we had here, and we mentioned this a little bit before the break, but I found this really interesting. It was this distinction between the emotional responses to macro versus craft. And I thought that was funny. I chuckled about that because I was like, because I think there was a period, and maybe it still is. There was a period for a long time that people were just like, no, I hate macro. I'm not going to drink it. Macro's terrible. It's swill. None of this stuff. And I think people are like me and like Marshall and other people are starting to say, no, I still like macro beers, and it's becoming a little bit more acceptable to drink macro. But I think there's still a perception. I still get warm and fuzzy when I see craft beers, right? Like I like drinking craft beers when I go to a bar or restaurant. Like I said, when I go to a restaurant, I'm not drinking Bud Light, Miller Lite, or Coors Light unless it's the only thing on the menu. I'm going to drink something craft if I can at a restaurant.
Well, you are characterizing the human population as if they were craft beer nerds. We have to remember that we are a very unique cross segment of the general American or Canadian consumer. And a lot of people don't drink craft beer. And then Cade, given that you're so close to the industry, I'm curious, do you know the latest numbers from like the BA, like what proportion of American beer consumption is considered craft at this point?
Yeah, no, I wish I did. That's a good one. I'll write that one down and get that back in feedback in one of the future Applying the Science ones, because that would be good to know. I mean, it's obviously increasing, right? I mean, a non-alcoholic beer has been increasing in market share for the last several years.
Craft beer.
Oh, craft beer.
What proportion of all beer consumption is craft versus macro in the latest figures? Have you seen anything?
Yeah. No, I don't know, but I'd like to look that up too. I'll try to get all of those, right? Like the craft beer versus macro, and then also what portion is non-alcoholic as well. Last I heard it was somewhere around like 13 or 15% or something like that.
Is craft?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Because I believe, I remember hearing a few years ago, I don't know if Portland still holds this title, but it was like the most by proportion craft beer consumption of any city in the US. And it was like crazy high, like 50% or something of beer consumed in Portland, Oregon is craft. But nationally, it is a totally different perspective in aggregate.
Yeah, well, and I want to walk that back a little bit, because I remember somebody telling a story a few months back about like how the BA never thought, or they were like aspirationally trying to get to 20% of the market, and then they hit that number, and so then they're trying to get to like 30%. So it's got to be more than 20%. I don't know where it is right now, and I don't want to get too far or too much further out over my skis. So I'll save that one for a future feedback, but we'll get there and get that. But you're right. I mean, a huge portion of the world still drinks macro lager, right? I mean, I think it is Budweiser is the number one selling beer in the entire world, right?
And there's probably a lot of people at this point who have had craft beer, but they don't really have the lexicon or the understanding to delineate between porter and IPA, let alone porter and stout. I think that at this point in America, most people have had craft beer of some type, but a lot of them probably haven't gone as deeply as we have. And beer is kind of beer, and they don't, necessarily know where one style starts and another one ends.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, again, this is all about profiling the consumer, right? To figure out what the consumer wants and what they like and where they're drinking it. Like I said, as opposed to other ways where people are breaking down the beer and looking at the different components and trying to figure out how to accentuate the beers. This is looking at the consumer. So I wanted to ask some questions about like implications. Like, what are the implications of this research in your mind?
Well, I think for one is that he provides some insights into how to craft a non-alc recipe that could theoretically sell better, right? We heard that, at least in Nova Scotia, I would imagine this would hold true down here, is they don't like bland or thin or watery non-alc beers. That makes sense. We did hear, though, that they don't like bitter beers, and I think in different markets, bitter could probably work. But I do think that it's important to understand the market segment you're going after. Because like we were talking about here in our example, and also like we heard earlier in the conceptualization, if your framework for beer is Miller Lite, you need to make and that's the market segment you're going after, the non-alc beer needs to taste kind of like Miller Lite. But the craft beer enthusiast that wants to take a break from alcohol for the moment, for the month, whenever it may be, they're not going to be going for those light lager imitations. They're going to want flavorful craft beer experiences without the alcohol included. And so I think that knowing your market segment, knowing your lane is an important understanding or learning from this study, because we're learning that there's different types of non-alc drinkers, and the type of context that they come from really dictates what they're looking for and what they would enjoy and find pleasant.
Sure, and I mean, I think that also extends to like locations as well, too, right? I think there's some opportunity here. I mean, you were just talking about that bar that was non-alcoholic. I mean, that's kind of cool to think about. Like, wait, I can actually order something that's non-alcoholic. I mean, I think for a while, a lot of bars or restaurants were just trying to order, do it for pregnant women, or again, people who have health conditions, or recovering from alcohol addiction, or any of those things. They're trying to offer, non-alcoholic beverages to those kinds of people. But there's really an opportunity here to market like to the designated driver, or the person that's just tired of drinking alcohol for that day and ready to drink something else, at the end of the day. Or, hey, you've sat here after, and you've had your 2 beers after work, and, I don't want to serve you a third beer. Hey, why don't you try this non-alcoholic beer? It tastes great too. And that way you can sober up a little bit before you drive home, and you can still drink your beer. There's a lot of opportunity here to market, to people who would be consuming these at restaurants and breweries. And then what about like pairing it with food, right? I mean, like there can be a way to say, hey, look at this non-alcoholic beer and how well it goes with, these dishes or whatever.
That being said, I think it's kind of a hard sell to a non-beer drinker, right?
Yeah, that's
like,
true. Yeah.
If you're, for religious reasons, you don't consume alcohol and you've never had a beer in your life, it's probably not going to taste that good, right? Maybe a fruited non-alc Berliner or something like that has a flavor that non-beer drinkers would have some sort of familiarity with. But let's face it, beer is an acquired taste. And you and I have definitely acquired it and we love it. But, that very first sip of beer, most people are like, oh, this is gross. And so I think that non-alc beer will really be for a beer drinker that's not drinking beer in that moment. And it reminds me of a funny story I heard. There was this kid in elementary school, and he was bringing in O'Doul's in his lunchbox every day to school. He just loved O'Doul's. And eventually the teacher was noticed it, and they're like, you can't do that. But it's technically non-alcoholic, but I just thought that was so funny. The idea of this third grade kid that loved O'Doul's.
It just loves the taste of O'Doul's. That's hilarious. I mean, I think about it too. It's always funny when they card me at the grocery store when I'm buying non-alcoholic beer. I'm like, this, it's like, okay.
Do you have to be 21 to buy it?
Well, at least at the grocery store I go to, it cards you. It rings up. It's automatic on the register. Even on self-checkout, it rings through and it's like, nope, age restricted, got to be 21, and they have to come.
Yeah, now I wonder, because if it's 0.0, I don't know if they would require that or not. And I believe that there are some non-alc brewers that you can actually order them on the internet.
Yeah.
Because it's not bound by the same distribution laws that alcoholic beer is.
Makes sense, right? If it doesn't have alcohol, then you may be able to distribute it in ways that you can't with alcoholic beer. That also just might be the grocery store that I go to too. I mean, they might just log it under the beer codes, and because it's under the beer code, it just automatically gets that 21 and up label. But in any event, so it's interesting because that consumer, right? That person that's you or me or Matt, in this case, that is a craft beer drinker that likes beer, but sometimes doesn't want the alcohol. That consumer wasn't reflected from the focus group, right? I mean, and Matt mentioned this, and he just wasn't there. I mean, but on the flip side, I mentioned this in the episode, and I want to say it again here too. The people that were mentioned make sense, right? Pregnant, avoiding it for health, totally avoiding alcohol, religious reasons, not wanting to drink, being able to drink it anywhere. All of these reasons are totally valid reasons, and I think a lot of consumers are out there drinking it for those reasons as well. So there's a lot of room to play here, right? There's a lot of potential consumers that could drink non-alcoholic beer.
But sadly, as we mentioned earlier, we don't really see it at local tap rooms. And I wonder if that will ever change, right? I don't think we have enough time to really dive into all the methods for how we produce it. There's been prior episodes that have talked about that. But if you were to listen to one of those prior episodes that talks about NA production, it's not easy and it's not cheap. And there's a lot of ways that can go wrong. And you need to really be careful that you have a food safe product that can be problematic when you don't have as low of a pH or ethanol in solution. And so I guess, I'm not that surprised we don't really see it out in the wild outside of these, breweries like Athletic that have invested a ton of capital to make this product at scale. And so I kind of wonder if that market dynamic will hold back the SKU to the point where it won't ever catch up.
Yeah, maybe there's some innovation coming, right? Maybe as more consumers want it, the innovation comes, and maybe we start pasteurizing, or pasteurization equipment becomes cheaper or more accessible, along those lines. Or maybe some new packages come available, right? Like, I could certainly see a situation where there's eco-friendly packaging, that becomes available. That's also, antimicrobial or something, or any of those ways. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity for advancement, but yeah, for right now, that does seem like that's going to be a challenge, right? Getting the beer out and keeping it stable in the marketplace is pretty difficult. I had one question too. Two questions. First of all, have you ever brewed a non-alcoholic beer?
I have not. I've brewed low alcohol beers in the sub 3, but never anything below 2.5.
So let me ask you this question then, and I'm curious about your response. If you brewed a non-alcoholic beer, would you take it to homebrew bottle shares?
You bet I would. I would love to share that.
Yeah. Right. I feel like for me, this was an interesting one because it's like, oh, wait, well, I'm going to homebrew bottle shares to share beer, right? And that's alcohol. But at the same time, right? Like, I'd love to share a non-alcoholic beer that I brewed, at a bottle share or something like that. So like home brewers or brewers who have got the, commercial brewers, but especially home brewers, if you're brewing non-alcoholic beers, bring them to bottle shares and share those things. That'd be a lot of fun to start seeing non-alcoholic beers pop up at HomebrewCon or, bottle shares.
Especially if someone could brew one that really trick people into thinking it was a session strength beer. I don't think that you're going to be able to trick someone into thinking that it's like a 15% barrel aged imperial stout that's actually 0.5%, but it seems reasonable that you could make an NA beer that's so good that it tastes like a, low strength alcoholic beer.
Yeah, I mean, any brewers out there, especially any home brewers, challenge accepted. You maybe challenge offered by Jordan here. Make a non-alcoholic beer that tastes as good as the beer, and see if you can do that. Well, Jordan, this was a pretty fun episode for me, and I guess again for you as a social scientist, it had to be a blast working through this.
Yeah, I really hoped that we can see more of these types of studies. The hard science stuff is also great too, and it really helps make the beverage that we love, but it's cool to kind of think about what do people actually think.
Yeah. What do people actually think and what do they want? And again, answering those 5 W's. I just think that's a cool way to think about some of this science, especially for me, like as a chemist perspective, a hard science, right? Studying it here at Oregon State, it's really cool to see, take a step back and look at, do consumers find this at all important? Do you have one big takeaway from the episode?
I just want people to continue making non-alcoholic beers. I think it's an exciting idea, and I'm excited to see where it goes.
Well, that sounds good to me. And so Jordan and I will be back in 2 weeks with our next Applying the Science episode. And until then, be sure to check out the Brewlosophy podcast, the Hop Chronicles, Short and Shoddy, Brew It Yourself, Experiments, and the new Brewlosophy show, all over at brewlosophy.com. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.